Imagine standing on a quiet lakeshore at sunrise, fishing line cutting the mist, when flashing police lights suddenly slice through the calm. That was the moment my ordinary morning exploded into chaos, because a furious homeowners association had decided I didn't belong there. They screamed about trespassing, rules, and fines, confident they had power on their side. What they didn't know was that this lake, every ripple and shoreline stone, legally belonged to me. And by the end of that day, their arrogance would cost them $8.2 million. This story didn't start with drama. It started years earlier, when I bought a modest property near what everyone casually called the community lake. The listing mentioned shared access, vague language that most buyers would ignore. I didn't. I hired a land surveyor, pulled dusty county records, and read deeds older than the neighborhood itself. Buried in legal descriptions and forgotten easements was a shocking truth: the lake wasn't communal at all. It had been privately deeded decades before the HOA even existed. Still, I kept quiet. I didn't fence it off or put up signs. I liked the peace, and I didn't want conflict. Neighbors fished there, kids played along the shore, and the HOA held picnics every summer. I watched, waited, and kept my paperwork locked away. Then one morning, I decided to fish from the bank, same as I had many times before. That's when the HOA president stormed over, phone already recording, accusing me of stealing community resources. She demanded my name, threatened lawsuits, and called the police while neighbors gathered like it was entertainment. I stayed calm, said nothing, and kept fishing. When the officers arrived, even they assumed I was in the wrong. But assumptions can be expensive. As documents came out and tempers rose, the truth began cracking the HOA's confidence. Lines were crossed, legal threats were made, and irreversible mistakes followed. By sunset, the power balance had completely flipped, setting off a chain reaction no one saw coming. The police officers approached with the calm confidence of people who believed this would be a quick removal. One asked for my ID, the other gestured toward the lake and said, "Sir, the HOA says this is private community property." I nodded politely and handed over my license without argument. Around us, neighbors whispered, phones held high, already imagining a dramatic arrest. The HOA president folded her arms, smiling like victory was guaranteed. I asked the officer a simple question: "Before you make a decision, may I show you something?" He hesitated, then agreed. From my truck, I retrieved a thick folder, edges worn, tabs carefully labeled. The smile on the HOA president's face faltered as soon as she saw the paperwork. I explained, calmly and clearly, that I owned not just access rights, but the entire lake bed and shoreline under a private deed recorded decades ago. The officers stepped aside to review the documents. Minutes passed. The crowd grew quieter. One officer made a phone call to county dispatch, requesting verification of parcel numbers. The HOA president suddenly grew louder, insisting the papers were fake, accusing me of intimidation, and demanding my immediate removal. That outburst would later matter more than she realized. When the officer returned, his tone had changed. He addressed the HOA president, not me, and asked if she had documentation proving the lake was community-owned. She didn't. She said the HOA had always used it, as if tradition outweighed law. The officer shook his head. "Ma'am, use doesn't equal ownership." That's when things escalated. The HOA board members, now arriving one by one, began issuing verbal citations, threatening fines, and declaring emergency meetings. They ordered contractors to block the access road and tried to physically prevent me from fishing. One board member even grabbed my rod. The officers intervened, warning them to step back. What the HOA didn't understand was that every threat, every order, and every obstruction was being documented. Their actions crossed from misunderstanding into unlawful interference. When they refused to stop, the police issued a warning not to me, but to them. By the time the officers left, the narrative had shifted. I wasn't a trespasser anymore. I was a property owner being harassed. And the HOA had just handed me leverage they could never take back. They still thought they could fix it with lawyers. They were wrong. That evening, while the neighborhood buzzed with rumors, I sat at my kitchen table and laid every document out in order. Deeds, surveys, tax records, correspondence, each page told the same story with brutal clarity. I had paid property taxes on that lake for years. Quietly. Reliably. The county recognized it as mine, even if the HOA never bothered to check. What they saw as a shared amenity was, in legal terms, a privately owned asset they had been exploiting. The next morning, a certified letter arrived at my door. The HOA's law firm accused me of disrupting community peace and demanded I cease unauthorized use of the lake. I laughed when I read it, not out of arrogance, but disbelief. They were doubling down on a lie, and in doing so, they were stepping into a trap entirely of their own making. I forwarded the letter to my attorney, a quiet man who specialized in property disputes and hated bullies. He called me within an hour. "Do they realize what they've done?" he asked. When I said no, he replied, "Good. Let's keep it that way." He drafted a response that was polite, factual, and devastating. It included copies of the deed, proof of tax payments, and a formal notice demanding the HOA stop representing the lake as community property. Instead of backing off, the HOA panicked. They called an emergency meeting and sent notices claiming I was trying to steal a lake from the neighborhood. They hired surveyors, issued new rules, and even tried to retroactively amend their bylaws. None of it mattered. You can't vote your way into ownership of land you don't own. Then came the real mistake. To protect community interests, the HOA signed a development agreement with an investor, promising exclusive lake rights for a luxury expansion project. They took a large advance payment and used the lake as collateral. On paper, it looked like a smart move. In reality, it was fraud. When my attorney discovered the agreement, his voice went cold. "This," he said, "is where the numbers get very big. Because the moment the investor learned the truth, lawsuits would fly. Not just against the HOA, but against every board member personally involved." The lake was no longer just a fishing spot. It was a financial time bomb, and the countdown had already started. The investor found out faster than the HOA expected. 2 days after their so-called emergency meeting, black SUVs rolled into the neighborhood, not for intimidation, but for assessment. Men in tailored suits walked the shoreline, taking photos, measuring distances, and asking questions the HOA couldn't answer without lying. By noon, the tone shifted. Smiles vanished. Phone calls became tense. And by sunset, the investor's legal team had everything they needed. That night, my attorney received a call requesting a private meeting. The investor wasn't angry at me. They were furious at the HOA. Millions had already changed hands, architectural plans were finalized, and marketing materials had gone out promising exclusive private lake access. All of it was built on a false claim of ownership. My attorney listened, said very little, and then explained the truth in one calm sentence: "My client owns the lake outright." Silence followed. Then one word. "How?" The answer was simple. Law beats assumptions. Deeds beat bylaws. And arrogance beats itself. The next morning, the HOA president showed up at my door without cameras, without confidence, and without the board. She tried a softer tone, talking about misunderstandings and community harmony. She suggested compromise. Shared ownership. Maybe a buyout at a fair price. I told her the same thing I'd said from the start: I just wanted to fish in peace. Everything else had been their choice. What she didn't realize was that the damage was already irreversible. The investor had issued a formal demand letter to the HOA for breach of contract, fraud, and misrepresentation. The number at the bottom made my stomach tighten: $8.2 million. That figure represented losses, penalties, and projected revenue. And it was only the beginning. Board members started resigning within hours. Emails leaked. Neighbors began asking uncomfortable questions about where their dues had gone. The HOA's insurance provider refused coverage, citing intentional misconduct. Suddenly, the organization that once threatened me with fines couldn't even afford basic legal defense. The lake, once a symbol of community pride, became a liability everyone wanted to distance themselves from. Signs quietly disappeared. Event calendars were erased. And the same people who had cheered when the cops were called now avoided eye contact. Through it all, I kept fishing. Not out of spite, but principle. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about what happens when power is assumed instead of proven. And the reckoning had only just begun. Court papers arrived like falling dominoes. First the investor sued the HOA. Then individual board members were named personally. After that, a class action suit formed from homeowners who claimed they had been misled into buying properties advertised as lakefront community homes. Every claim traced back to the same lie, that the HOA owned the lake. By the end of the week, panic had fully replaced arrogance. Depositions began quickly. I was called as a witness, not a defendant. Sitting across polished tables, I listened as former board members contradicted each other under oath. One admitted they had never checked county records. Another confessed they assumed someone else already had. The HOA president tried to shift blame to a previous board, but documents proved she had signed the development agreement herself. Watching certainty collapse into fear was surreal. The judge wasted no time. A temporary injunction was issued, banning the HOA from using, advertising, or profiting from the lake in any form. Security was ordered removed. Access roads reopened. For the first time, the law publicly acknowledged what I had known all along: the lake was mine. That single ruling shattered the HOA's remaining credibility. Behind the scenes, settlement talks exploded. The investor demanded full repayment plus damages. Homeowners demanded refunds and fee reductions. Attorneys circled like sharks, billing by the hour. The HOA tried to negotiate, but they had nothing left to offer. Their budget was frozen. Their accounts were under review. Even their office was locked after the landlord learned what was happening. One afternoon, I received a formal apology letter. It wasn't sincere. It was strategic. They asked me to help reduce their liability by publicly supporting a settlement. My attorney advised against it. They didn't just make a mistake, he said. They built an empire on one. As the case progressed, the number became official. $8.2 million in confirmed losses. That figure echoed through the neighborhood like a warning siren. Property values dipped. For sale signs multiplied. The HOA dissolved under court supervision, its authority stripped entirely. And the irony? Had they never called the cops, none of this would have happened. I would have kept fishing quietly. The lake would have remained a background detail. Their hunger for control exposed everything. Now, the neighborhood stood changed. Rules vanished. Power shifted. And I finally understood something important: ownership isn't just about land. It's about standing firm when challenged by people who never expected resistance. With the HOA dissolved, silence settled over the neighborhood in a way I hadn't felt since moving in. No more warning letters. No more posted rules. No more committees policing grass height or lake access. What replaced it was uncertainty. Homeowners weren't sure who was in charge anymore, and for the first time, many realized how much power they had blindly handed over to a small group of people who never truly owned anything they controlled. Several neighbors came to me quietly, not to argue, but to apologize. Some admitted they had cheered when the cops were called. Others said they assumed the HOA must be right, because authority usually sounds confident. I listened, nodded, and kept my responses simple. I wasn't interested in blame. I was interested in closure. The court appointed an administrator to unwind the HOA's remaining assets. Dues collection stopped immediately. Contracts were cancelled. Vendors demanded payment the HOA couldn't make. Every financial decision made over the last 5 years was audited. What investigators found was staggering: inflated contracts, undocumented expenses, and decisions made without votes or disclosures. The lake wasn't the only thing misrepresented. It was just the most valuable. Meanwhile, the investor case reached its climax. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the HOA's former board agreed to a settlement that wiped them out financially. Insurance refused to cover it. Retirement accounts were liquidated. Properties were sold. The $8.2 million loss became real, not theoretical, and it landed squarely on the people who had signed their names with confidence instead of caution. Through all of this, I was offered multiple buyout proposals. Developers wanted the lake. The city wanted recreational access. Even residents floated the idea of pooling funds to purchase it collectively. I considered each offer carefully. The numbers were tempting. But money had never been the point. I declined them all. Instead, I recorded the lake as protected private property with limited public easements. Fishing allowed by permission. No development. No commercialization. Just water, land, and quiet. Some people were surprised. Others were relieved. In a strange way, the lake became a symbol, not of conflict, but of restraint. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the water turned gold, I cast my line again. No cameras. No police. No shouting. Just the sound of nature reclaiming its space. And that's when it truly hit me. This wasn't a story about winning. It was a story about what happens when unchecked authority finally meets documented truth. Life didn't snap back to normal overnight. Without the HOA, the neighborhood had to relearn how to exist without constant oversight. Some people thrived immediately. Others felt lost without rules telling them what to do. Yard signs went up asking for new associations, informal committees, even city involvement. But after everything that had happened, most residents were cautious. Trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild easily. I became an unwilling reference point. Anytime a discussion started about authority or ownership, my name came up. Remember the lake, someone would say, and the room would go quiet. The incident had left a scar, but also a lesson. Power without verification is just noise, and noise collapses the moment facts enter the room. A few former board members tried to rehabilitate their image. They claimed ignorance. They said they were just volunteers. But court records don't care about intent, only impact. Their names were permanently tied to one of the most expensive HOA failures the county had ever seen. New neighborhoods nearby quietly dissolved their own associations after watching what happened. No one wanted to be next. The city eventually approached me, not to take the lake, but to ask permission to use it as an example in public planning seminars. A real-world case study on land rights, governance overreach, and due diligence. I agreed, on one condition: no names, no spectacle. Just facts. If my experience could prevent even one community from repeating the same mistake, it was worth it. I also learned something personal through all of this. Staying quiet doesn't always mean staying safe. I had known the truth for years but chose peace over clarity. That choice allowed others to build power on top of my silence. When I finally spoke, the fallout was massive. Not because I was wrong, but because the lie had grown too big. One afternoon, a young couple stopped me by the lake. They had just moved in and had heard the story, though not the details. They asked if fishing was allowed. I smiled, handed them a spare rod, and said yes. The look of relief on their faces reminded me why this mattered. Not ownership. Not money. But fairness. The water was calm that day, reflecting the sky perfectly. No fences. No signs. Just an understanding built on honesty instead of control. The lake no longer divided the neighborhood. It grounded it. And yet, the story wasn't finished. Because consequences don't end when court cases close. They echo. And the final echo of this one was still approaching. The echo came months later, quietly but unmistakably. Long after courtrooms emptied and headlines faded, the ripple effects of the HOA's collapse kept spreading. Real estate disclosures changed across the county. Listings that once boasted HOA-managed amenities now included detailed ownership clauses. Buyers asked harder questions. Title companies dug deeper. What happened at my lake had shifted behavior far beyond our neighborhood. Former board members faced consequences they never imagined. Some struggled to find work once background checks revealed their involvement in litigation tied to fraud. Others moved away entirely, unable to live with the weight of being recognized as the people who lost the lake. Their authority had evaporated, replaced by a reputation that followed them everywhere. Power, once misused, has a long memory. For me, life slowed again. I returned to routines I'd put on hold during the legal storm. Morning walks. Evening fishing. The quiet joy of knowing where I stood. But peace doesn't mean forgetfulness. I stayed vigilant, ensuring records were updated, boundaries were clear, and no ambiguity remained for anyone to exploit in the future. Clarity, I learned, is kindness. Unexpectedly, letters began arriving from strangers. People in other states. Other countries. HOA members, property owners, even renters. They shared stories of fines, threats, and overreach. Some asked for advice. Others just wanted reassurance that standing up was possible. I responded when I could, always with the same message: verify first, then speak calmly, and document everything. Truth doesn't need volume. It needs patience. One letter stood out. It was from a retired surveyor who thanked me for trusting records over reputation. He wrote, "Land doesn't lie. People do, sometimes without realizing it." That line stuck with me. The HOA hadn't started as villains. They started as people who never questioned their assumptions. And assumptions, left unchecked, grow dangerous. The lake itself seemed unchanged by human drama. Seasons passed. Fish returned. Birds nested along the shore. Nature never cared who claimed ownership. It only responded to how it was treated. That perspective grounded me more than any legal victory ever could. On the anniversary of the incident, I stood at the same spot where the police lights once flashed. The water was still. No one watched. No one challenged me. And in that silence, I understood the final lesson this chapter of my life had taught me: true ownership isn't enforced through intimidation. It's upheld through responsibility. One chapter remained. Not of conflict, but of meaning. Because every story like this deserves an ending that explains why it mattered at all. Looking back now, it's almost hard to believe how a single fishing line in the water unraveled years of unchecked authority. What began as a quiet morning turned into a defining moment, not just for me, but for an entire community. The lake never changed. The people around it did. And that difference is what made everything matter. The final court ruling arrived without drama. No gavel slam. No audience. Just a clean, final document confirming what had already been proven again and again. Ownership affirmed. Liability assigned. Case closed. The $8.2 million loss was officially recorded, marking the end of the HOA's existence and the beginning of accountability for those who once believed power alone made them untouchable. I didn't celebrate. There was no satisfaction in watching people lose homes, savings, or reputations. But there was relief. Relief in knowing the truth stood firm when tested. Relief that records, patience, and restraint had outweighed noise and intimidation. And relief that I never let anger guide my decisions. Anger burns fast. Facts endure. Over time, the neighborhood found a new balance. Without an HOA, residents talked to each other more. Problems were handled face to face. Disagreements still happened, but they no longer hid behind authority letters or threat notices. Ironically, the community became more connected once control was removed. The lake, once a symbol of division, quietly became a place of shared respect. Sometimes, I'm asked if I'd do anything differently. The honest answer is yes. I would have spoken sooner. Silence may feel peaceful, but it gives space for false narratives to grow. Clarity early can prevent catastrophe later. That lesson alone was worth every stressful moment. If there's one thing this story proves, it's that you don't need power to protect what's yours. You need preparation. You need documentation. And you need the courage to stay calm when everyone expects you to back down. Because the moment you don't, everything changes. I still fish at that same spot. Same shoreline. Same water. But now, every cast carries a reminder. Not of conflict, but of balance. Rights come with responsibility. Ownership comes with restraint. And truth doesn't need shouting to be heard. The HOA thought they were enforcing rules. In reality, they exposed themselves. They called the cops expecting control, and instead triggered consequences they could never undo. All because they never asked the simplest question: do we actually own this? That question cost them everything. And answering it gave me my peace back.